A humiliating world. How Russia lost and Japan did not win. Late in the evening of February 8, 1904, a group of Japanese destroyers torpedoed Russian ships standing in a roadstead near Port Arthur, and two best Russian battleships, Retvizan and Tsesarevich, were seriously damaged as a result. The next day war was officially declared on Russia. On the same day, a Japanese squadron attacked the cruiser Varyag and the gunboat Koreats in the Korean port of Kamulpo. Thus began the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which formally ended with the victory of Japan, but in reality left both sides unsatisfied. The cause of the war was the intention of both states to establish their control over Korea and Manchuria. Russia in the last quarter of the 19th century began to develop the Far East, which previously was hampered by its great remoteness from the center. The way from St. Petersburg to the eastern outskirts of the empire was 3 months in one direction. With the beginning of Trans-Siberian Railway construction, normal development of the region and inclusion of Manchuria in the Russian sphere of influence became possible at last. The Japanese, who after the Meiji Restoration in 1868 were actively westernizing, claimed to be the only great Asian power, but a great power at that time was inconceivable without colonies and spheres of influence, so the Japanese also counted on strengthening in Korea, Manchuria and part of China. Japanese and Russian interests clashed in the Far East. Initially, they tried to resolve the issue through diplomacy, but it was to no avail. The Japanese only agreed to recognize Russia's interest in Manchuria, through which a branch of the cell ran, but demanded the full withdrawal of troops from Manchuria and a number of concessions in Korea obtained 10 years earlier by a Russian businessman Yul Brynner, incidentally, the grandfather of the famous Hollywood actor Yul Brynner. For its part, Russia agreed to relinquish its Korean concessions and its influence in Korea, but only in exchange for the Japanese recognition that Manchuria would remain within the Russian sphere of influence. While continuing diplomatic negotiations, the Japanese were simultaneously preparing for war. The world's best shipbuilders, the British, had a brand new fleet of battleships ordered on a turnkey basis. It was vital for the Japanese to gain superiority at sea in order to organize a landing on the mainland. In addition, the Japanese managed to enlist the diplomatic support of the British, who were also not interested in increasing Russian influence in the Far East. The British concluded a treaty of alliance with Japan, which stipulated that Britain would enter the war in the event that Japan and any other power were to enter the war with a third party. This treaty was made specifically with a view to the Russian-French alliance, so that France would not be tempted to participate in the war. In the end, the parties fought face to face, but the Japanese also enjoyed the diplomatic and propaganda support of the United States and Britain, and Russia, France and Germany, who, however, did not take any active steps. On February 6, 1904, Japan broke off diplomatic relations with Russia, and a day later, without declaring war, it attacked the ships that were in the outer roadstead of Port Arthur, seriously damaging 2 of its best battleships. On February 9, war was officially declared. The main attention of the Japanese was concentrated on the once Chinese fortress of Port Arthur, now in the hands of the Russian Empire. The main task of the Japanese was to lock in the port and, with a favorable set of circumstances, to destroy the Russian squadron in order to conduct an unhindered landing in Manchuria. After several unsuccessful attempts, the Japanese managed to temporarily block the squadron in the harbor and conduct a landing of troops in Manchuria. Russian troops did not interfere with the siege of Port Arthur. The fortress was securely fortified. Under the plan, it was assumed that Port Arthur would divert a large part of the Japanese forces, which would not allow the Japanese to take possession of Manchuria. The fact is that the Russian army in Manchuria was small and was seriously inferior in quantity to the mobilized Japanese army. In addition, most of the army was dispersed to garrisons. In addition, most of the Japanese had a tangible advantage. They operated in their own backyard, while for Russia the Far East was a very distant and peripheral region. Even taking into account the recently commissioned Trans-Siberian Railroad, it still took a month to deliver just 1 army corps to the theater of operations due to its low throughput capacity, whereas the Japanese used to deliver a landing force to the mainland in less than a day. The Japanese also understood all this, so they staked on swift attacks, not counting any losses. It was necessary to defeat the Russian troops in Manchuria before they received reinforcements from Russia. In early May, the invasion of Japanese forces in Manchuria began and the first ground battle of the war occurred, the battle on the Yalu River, in which a 20,000th Russian detachment stood against a force 3 times larger than the Japanese. The commander of the detachment, Zasilik, had the order to conduct reconnaissance battle, find out the strength of the Japanese army, and then retreat. At the same time, the Japanese began to land near Port Arthur in order to capture the fortress and finally destroy the Russian squadron. The landed forces cut the railway communication of the fortress with Manchuria. It was impossible to lift the siege with the help of the garrison's forces because the Japanese had too much superiority, so some forces of the Manchurian army were sent to unblock the fortress. However, it was not possible to lift the siege. There was a serious threat of the surrender of the fortress, after which the Japanese would not fight in two directions and could concentrate all the forces in one direction. The Manchu army attempted an offensive, but in two major battles, at Liaoyang and Sha, it was not possible to identify a winner. After the failure to unblock the fortress, the Japanese were able to besiege and bombard Port Arthur with artillery unhindered. The siege of the fortress, which lasted 6 months, began. The Japanese made 4 attempted assaults, but they all turned into huge losses to the attackers. Nevertheless, during the 4th assault, the Japanese managed to seize one of the strategic heights, and thanks to this, they began firing artillery at blocked in the harbor Russian squadron. After that, the fortress defense became practically meaningless. The remnants of the garrison were too small to withstand the many times superior Japanese forces. After a 6-month siege, the fortress surrendered, and the squadron, locked in the harbor, was sunk. Several times it made attempts to break through, but the ratio of the Japanese and Russian squadrons, 5-1, did not allow them to finish successfully. The Japanese were able to concentrate all forces to attack Manchuria. In February, there was a general land battle at Mukden. Later, it was very actively used in propaganda by the Russian revolutionaries, who shouted about the Mukden massacre, the Mukden beating, etc. However, it was the Japanese troops who suffered the most significant losses in this battle. Although the Russian troops retreated and left Mukden, for the Japanese this victory was rather Pyrrhic. They won a local victory, but strategically the situation was not in their favor. Japanese losses were too heavy, and there was nothing to replenish them with. Already the whole country was mobilized. In fact, the Japanese lost the opportunity to conduct large-scale offensive operations on land, and until the end of the war, did not undertake them. While the Russian troops fully retained their fighting ability, retreating to previously prepared defensive lines and waiting for reinforcements. There were no more land battles in the war, but at sea the Japanese managed to achieve a tangible victory in the Battle of Tsushima. In autumn 1904, a squadron under the command of Vice Admiral Rojdestvensky was transferred from the Baltic to the Far East to help the blockaded ships at Port Arthur. However, while the squadron was on the road, the fortress fell, and her campaign became pointless. Rojdestvensky was instructed to bring the ships to Vladivostok. For this purpose, he chose the most dubious way, through the Tsushima Strait. The Japanese believed that the Russian squadron would not go through it because it was too dangerous and could easily become a trap. Rojdestvensky also thought that the Japanese would decide that he would not send his ships through it and chose this route. The Japanese knew in advance the composition of the squadron and its numbers, whereas Rojdestvensky had no idea what kind of force he might engage. He hoped to skip the dangerous section and bring the ships to the port without a fight. Since he had no idea what forces he might encounter, the admiral did not have even an approximate plan for a possible battle. In addition, he completely abandoned reconnaissance, hoping to quickly reach the port without attracting attention. In addition, the ship's personnel, after more than 6 months of travel, were exhausted and discouraged after it became clear that the trip was pointless. The Japanese, on the other hand, had an overwhelming advantage over the squadron. 117 ships against 36, not counting several hospital ships and obsolete vessels, meaningless in battle. As a result, the Russian squadron was trapped in the Tsushima Strait and destroyed by the superior Japanese forces. An already maximally unfavorable set of circumstances was exacerbated by the inarticulate command of Rojdestvensky, who was soon wounded, after which command chaos reigned in the squadron. The Russo-Japanese War was almost the only war in the history of the 20th century in which all the requirements of the Hague Convention, the forerunner of the Geneva Convention, for the treatment of prisoners of war, were carefully observed. Both sides obeyed the letter of the law meticulously. The POWs were well treated, they received decent food, were not put to work, and were not subjected to hazing. In Japanese prisoner of war camps, there were 70,000 Russian soldiers, mostly from the garrison of Port Arthur, as well as prison sailors of the squadron which was defeated in the Battle of Tsushima. These prisoners of war were of some interest to Russian revolutionaries. By that time, the 1905 revolution had begun in Russia, who actively cooperated with Japan. The first to arrive was the American George Kennan, grandfather of the famous American diplomat Kennan, who who became one of the architects of the Cold War. Kennan specialized in Russia, had close ties to many revolutionaries, and became famous in America for acting out theatrical representations of the unbearable torture of the Tsar's penal colony. Kennan established contacts with the Japanese and obtained permission for the propaganda treatment of prisoners. For this purpose, he summoned the émigré revolutionary Sudzalovsky, Roussel, a professional Che Guevara, who had participated in the revolutionary movements of half the countries of the world, from Russia, Romania and England to America. Sudzalovsky set up a weekly newspaper in the POW camps, Japan and Russia, in which he tried to instill a revolutionary spirit in the prisoners. It was planned that immediately after their return to Russia, soldiers and sailors would join revolutionary parties and lead an active struggle against the government. One of the newspaper's employees was the sailor Novikov, who later became the famous writer Novikov Pryboy, author of Tsushima, which was published in multi-million copies in the USSR. However, Novikov's position as a collaborator with the Japanese and, in addition, a more radical newspaper Druzh's friend, was not understood by his campmates. He was considered a traitor, and the camp inhabitants tried to kill Novikov and several of his comrades in arms. The only thing that saved the future writer was that the Japanese, who foresaw such an outcome, gave Novikov and his staff daggers, thanks to which they managed to fight off the attackers and escape under the protection of the camp administration. After this incident, the Novikovites were moved from the camp to a hospital, where they were guarded by Japanese police. Sudzalovsky had far-reaching plans. He thought that after the Japanese seized Sakhalin, they would hand all the convicts over to him, and with the support of the Japanese army, would land in the Russian Far East and begin their victorious march towards Petersburg, freeing the convicts and reinforcing their army on the way. These plans, however, were not fated to come true. Neither were the hopes of the future leader of Poland, who came to Japan to ask for money for terrorist actions and hoped to get Polish prisoners of war for his battalions. The Japanese gave money, but no soldiers. Pilsudski's proposal seemed to them too adventurous, and besides, the war was coming to an end. By the spring of 1905, the situation was such that both sides were interested in peace talks. In Russia, a revolution with mass unrest and daily violence in the streets was taking place, while Japan, having achieved advantages at sea, paid with huge casualties for a few local successes on land. The Japanese army losses were twice as high as the Russian ones. At the same time, Russia acted with limited forces of the Manchurian army, which had the opportunity to be reinforced, and which only began to turn around in 1905 and reach its starting point. While the Japanese had exhausted their reserves for reinforcement, they lost every sixth soldier, about 80,000 from the 450,000 army, in the land battles. The Japanese were already conducting the war with maximum effort, and after such losses could not carry out large-scale offensive operations. In addition, the Japanese were under pressure from the Americans and the British, who supported them and insistently offered to mediate in the peace talks. Since the negotiations were under American patronage, Russia resorted to a diplomatic stratagem, appointing Witt, a liberal, to head the delegation, which immediately mollified the Americans, especially since they had no interest in increasing Japanese influence. Because of this, the Japanese had to moderate their ambitions, and in the end the Portsmouth Peace Treaty was more in Russia's favor. It ceded Japan's southern part of practically unpopulated Sakhalin, gave up its lease of Chinese Port Arthur, but it flatly refused to pay contribution because it didn't consider itself lost, whereas Japanese, practically ruined by war, hoped for it. As a result, the peace treaty was perceived negatively in both countries. But if in Russia they were dissatisfied, mainly because Japan wasn't crushed, although it could have been, in Japan there were widespread riots and pogroms caused by rage over a humiliating peace. The Japanese had long prepared for war, had firmly endured all the economic hardships, sacrificed 80,000 soldiers, about 250,000 in today's population proportions, and all for a measly piece of deserted Sakhalin and the lease of Port Arthur. The indignation was so great that riots broke out spontaneously in different parts of the country for several months. Several factors contributed to the unsuccessful course of the Russo-Japanese War. 1. The theater of military operations was located on the far periphery. Even taking into consideration the newly built Trans-Siberian Railway, the Far East was still the edge of the universe. Combat operations were not conducted on Russian territory. The transfer of troops and equipment there was difficult. Only one army corps made it to the theater of operations for a month. The Japanese, on the contrary, were fighting a war literally next door. 2. The Japanese were banking on a swift and rapid solution to their problems, since their poverty of resources and dependence on raw material supplies made them incapable of prolonged warfare. Russia, on the contrary, sought to prolong the conflict, recognizing this weakness of the Japanese. The Manchurian army was forced to conserve its personnel and retreat when losses became appreciable. After all, in the case of serious losses it was impossible to replenish the army immediately. This process would take a considerable amount of time, which would allow the Japanese to take possession of Manchuria. For this reason the Manchu army acted, as it seemed from outside, indecisively, often retreating to save strength, which gave the impression of permanent Japanese victories. The Japanese, on the other hand, attacked without regard for sacrifice in order to gain an advantage as quickly as possible and to begin peace negotiations. In 1905, due to the outbreak of revolution in Russia, the prolongation and continuation of the conflict was considered undesirable also in St. Petersburg, although in fact only by that time the Russian troops in Manchuria had received enough reinforcements to act freely. 3. The revolution in Russia actually opened a second front within the country. The revolutionary events caused the Japanese war to fade into the background. Many revolutionaries living in Europe actually openly cooperated with Japanese agents, obtaining weapons with their support for urban fighting in Russia. With the mediation of the Japanese, 2 unifying conferences of Russian revolutionaries were organized in Paris and Geneva, designed to create a broad revolutionary coalition to fight the government. Lenin took part in the Geneva conference, who soon abandoned it because of the predominance of the social revolutionaries. 4. Lack of support for the war in Russia. The public largely held revolutionary views and from the beginning stigmatized the war as imperialist, seeing in it only an additional opportunity to criticize the government. Any failures were repeatedly overblown. The Battle of Mukden was exclusively referred to as the Mukden disaster, the massacre, the meat grinder, etc., although the Japanese suffered almost twice as many losses and were unable to advance until the end of the war, while most of the Manchu army had survived and had the opportunity to replenish and continue operations. Although the Russian Empire was not defeated in the war and could continue it and even change its course on the mainland, landing in Japan was impossible. Of course, it was decided in St. Petersburg not to sacrifice in vain for an ephemeral sphere of influence in Korea and a piece of Sakhalin, but instead to focus on the revolution at home. If you were interested, thank the author by putting a like. And also do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the outputs of even more interesting videos of my channel. Turn on notifications by clicking on the bell and share this video with your friends. What else interesting can you add to this video? Write in the comments, it will be interesting to read.